He watched something press its faceless head to the back door, and then, for a long moment, it simply stood there, silent, still, as if listening for a life that had once belonged to the house. I'm the host of All Night Horrors. Tonight, 9 small Montana towns, 9 unsettling accounts drawn from witness interviews, police logs, and archivists' notes. The names you'll hear have been changed, witnesses are quoted in edited form, and locations are fictionalized so that we can focus on the experiences themselves, what people reported, what records show, and what was left unexplained. These are reported accounts. We do not claim to prove the supernatural. We do, however, take seriously the way these episodes ruined ordinary nights and altered ordinary lives. 9 towns, 9 nights, 9 stories. We begin with fog. Story 1. The fog at Patterson Hollow. Microhook. He thought it was a deer. Then the fog moved, and the shape did not. The first time Jonah called it in, he almost laughed. Jonah was 24, an equipment operator who had answered an ad and pulled a U-Haul into Patterson Hollow, a logging town tucked in the shadow of a glacier-carved ridge. The town existed in thin, self-sufficient strips, a diner with a bell that never stopped ringing, a general store that stocked everything except patience, and rows of clapboard houses that leaned into the fever of the wind. For a man who had grown up in city concrete, the silence at night felt like a kindness at first. People slept with windows cracked against the smell of pine and diesel. Nights had a way of folding the world into 2 things, what was lit and what was not. It began during the inversion season, late October, when the valley filled with a low, drifting fog that seemed to come up out of the river like a slow tide. Jonah went to bed at 9. At 11, the light on his back porch went out. He woke when the dog, an old yellow lab, barked at the window. Through the fog, the yard looked like a photograph smudged by breath. At the edge of the tree line, where the trees met open pasture, Jonah saw a figure, long, pale, draped in a rag that caught in the air like a torn sail. It didn't move like a human. It stood. When it moved, if that is the right word, it slid closer by a set of shutters, as if the fog itself was a lung drawing it in. Witness, Jonah, edited. At first I thought it was a deer or someone with a tarp. Then it just kept coming and the fog wrapped around it. The dog wouldn't stop. It got to the back door and there was nothing. No face, just cloth and blankness. Jonah pressed his face to the glass and saw, according to his report, a pale concave suggestion of a face pressed to the pane, fabric stretched over something that might have been a skull or might have been nothing at all. He said the entire front of the figure seemed to be a void. You could make out shoulders, vertical, as if a person had been pulled long and thin, but where eyes and mouth should be, there was instead a dull, uniform surface that reflected his porch light like wet paper. According to a local police report filed later that month, Jonah called dispatch at 11:41 p.m. The dispatcher logged him as panicked, yelling that there's a person outside, faceless, at his door. Patrols were dispatched. The first officer on scene described fog so thick you could taste metal, and a chill that crawled up through boots, reported in a typed supplement as dense valley inversion, visibility reduced, subject unable to be located on approach. The patrols found nothing awake, the dog, the porch light, and Jonah's trembling hands. But one detail creeped into later records. A neighbor, an elderly woman who lived half a block away, reported hearing a steady scraping at her back door for 3 nights straight prior to Jonah's indistinct rhythm, knuckles on glass, that stopped only when the fog lifted. Her neighborly note appears in the file as repeat disturbance, possible pattern. This was not the first time something like this had been reported in Patterson Hollow, according to a cache of old newspapers found in the county archive. A microfiche clipping dated October 1963, yellowed and creased, mentions a series of disappearances coinciding with persistent fog events. 3 people, all documented as missing between the last week of October and the first week of November in separate years, 1926, 1949, 1963. The language in the article is cautious. Unexplained absences, no bodies recovered. But the dates are precise, and someone had annotated the margins in pencil. Same week each year?
After Jonah fled the cottage to a friend's house, so he told the dispatcher, he returned, days later, with a flashlight and steel in his hands. He began to search the attic and basement for anything people might have slung together, a mask, a mannequin, anything that would explain a blank face pressed to his window. What he found instead was a stack of old town records jammed behind a sagging pantry shelf, a notebook or short notations listed by date and name, mostly grocery accounts and receipts. In between, in the same cramped hand, were names associated with the dates that the archives had flagged, 3 names circled over multiple decades. Witness, Jonah, edited. I pulled out a folded paper like they'd been shoved there for years. Little notes, names and weeks. I thought it was a weird ledger. Then I saw the month. It matched the old articles I'd seen at the library, same time of year. When Jonah took the paper into the county historical room, the archivist identified handwriting as belonging to a long-deceased logging foreman. The archivist contacted a retired sheriff who had once investigated the earlier disappearances.
He told Jonah quietly, "Things come in cycles here," and then coughed and redirected the conversation when asked directly what cycles meant. No body was ever found connected to Jonah's night with the fog. The police logged the call as unfounded because no physical evidence remained. The town quietly replaced Jonah's porch light with a motion-sensing bulb that flickered like a small, anxious heartbeat. Jonah left after the second autumn. Before he drove away, he told a friend he thought he had been watched for the whole month, how the silhouette always appeared at the edge of the fog 3 nights running, each time closer. Whether that figure was human, or a trick of light and cold, or something that had existed in Patterson Hollow long before him, is a debate between what the records show and what the living remember. For Jonah, whatever stood at the glass has become the picture that ends every thought of the town. Short pause in the valley. In Montana's coulees, fog doesn't roll in from an ocean. It creeps like water up the slope, lingering in hollow pockets where the world feels older than the map. For the people who live there, those pockets have names and histories. They also sometimes have visitors. If this episode is finding you at the right hour, and you want more of these stories, consider subscribing to All Night Horrors. It's quick, and it helps the show keep digging for archived records and witness interviews. Story 2. The Missing Logger, Miller's Ridge. Microhook. A blood trail runs into the woods and then simply stops. The call came in on a Tuesday evening according to the county dispatch log. It was late summer, a time when the sun leans long into the west and logging crews work until dusk. The missing man, referred to in records as the logger, was 38, dense-bodied from years of felling, with a family that lived in a trailer on the edge of Miller's Ridge. He was a man who kept time by saw and hammer. The dispatcher described the caller as frantic, reporting a co-worker missing from the site. When sheriff's deputies arrived, they found his rig idling on a service road, the driver's door open. Inside, a thermos tipped on its side, a work glove jammed between the seat and the console. There were signs of a struggle, broken brush on the roadside, and a smear of blood on the truck's tailgate. A search began. Evidence Layer 1. Photographs taken by the first deputy at the scene, later included in a district file, show a narrow blood trail of small drops leading into dense lodgepole pine. The trail tracks for roughly 50 feet and then stops. The deputy noted in his handwritten supplement, blood trail ends suddenly a tree line. No further signs of disturbance. Underbrush intact beyond this point. Evidence Layer 2. A witness, a dispatcher who spoke to the missing man on the radio that afternoon, tells a more confused story.
According to the dispatch log in an abbreviated interview, the missing logger had told his partner over the radio that someone had been watching from the creek. The log records, subject agitated, possible suspect wearing coveralls. The partner, later interviewed, told police he had seen a man in coveralls walking near the mill equipment. But in the camera footage from the site, which the county later released to investigative reporters, the image of the person is grainy and unhelpful. A tall silhouette in coveralls, face in shadow, moving away from the truck toward the trees. The search expanded. Tracking dogs picked up a scent and pulled a winding line away from the truck, across a small creek and up a steep embankment. Then the dogs balked, no scent beyond a certain ridge. They recorded heart-stopping whines and then turned back to the handlers without leading on. The dog's GPS collars later showed the route precise to within meters. The scent line dissipated as if someone had vanished into air. 2 nights later, a hiker found the logger's body 2 miles away, on the other side of a different ridge, in a ravine that looked as if it had never been walked. The coroner's report, later summarized in police materials, lists cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries, and estimated time of death as sometime in the night between the truck being found and the body being discovered. The injuries were consistent with blade wounds. There were no defensive wounds, according to the coroner, an odd detail in a case described by family members as a man who fought for everything. Witness, dispatcher, edited. We had the cameras, we had the truck, then nothing on the cameras for a stretch. It was like either someone moved him a long way without being seen or he went. 3 men were questioned over the following months, another logger with a history of fights, a transient trucker seen earlier in the day, and a supervisor whose alibi was thin. Security footage captured one of the men on record, walking in coveralls the afternoon of the incident. He told police he had been fixing a machine, hands greasy, and had never left the yard. His wife later provided receipts that placed him at a hardware store 9 miles away that afternoon. The receipts were included in the file as exculpatory evidence. Investigators ran DNA and cross-checked blood spatter patterns against the suspects. Nothing definitive linked any of them to the scene. 2 months later, the district attorney filed the case as unsolved, citing lack of provable connection. The community reacted in a way small towns often do, by naming suspects in kitchen conversations and by growing quieter around certain men. The missing logger's widow moved away with their 2 children. The mill's shift patterns never quite felt the same. What the records do show is that the blood trail's termination is not a clerical error.
The photographer's annotations mark where blood stops, and the officer's sketch of the scene places that stop at a hollow that doesn't align with an access path. There is no obvious place for someone to conceal themselves or a body without tripping a fence or making noise. The dog's behavior was later described in an after-action report as anomalous bulking and refusal to follow scent beyond a certain point. For those who believe in explanations that do not rely on the supernatural, there are theories that hold water. An accomplice carried the body, trajectories were misinterpreted, someone staged the trail. For others, family members and a handful of elders who keep oral lists, there remains the old local talk about a place in the timber where the trees hold onto echoes and the ground does not want to give up what it hides. For the dispatcher, the worst part was the unending proximity. He saw the suspects at the grocery, in the bar, at work. Names are mentioned in the records as Suspect A, Suspect B, and always as alleged. No charges were brought. The case file closes with the notation, active, no suspect. Between stories, the map of Montana is littered with small towns that grew around a single industry, mining, logging, rail. In those places, people know each other's shoes. That intimacy is a sort of shield, but it can also be a kind of vault where things are kept. Story 3, Mercy Ridge Hitchhiker. Microhook. He dropped her at Mercy Ridge and watched her step into a brick wall no one remembers. Highways in Montana are long and honest. Long-haul drivers will tell you that the road gives you a head full of strangers, hitchhikers, lost tourists, and the occasional familiar face that keeps turning up. This is the story of a driver who keeps seeing the same woman. The driver, referred to in files only as the trucker, was a man who'd been on the road for 20 years, who knew the rhythm of rest stop coffee, who could recite the county lines by the feel of the steering wheel. He told investigators that he noticed her first on a foggy night outside of a small town he knew as Mercy Ridge Junction, a place where the interstate narrows and a 2-lane heads toward a cluster of clinics and a now empty reservoir. She was always hitching on the same stretch of road, a young woman, maybe mid-20s, wearing an old floral dress and a denim jacket, hair tied back in a loose knot. She asked politely for a ride to Mercy Ridge Hospital. The trucker took her. She cried on his shoulder in silence. He delivered her at the hospital and watched her walk toward the side entrance and disappear around a blank brick wall. He thought little of it the first time. The world is full of errands. He saw her again a month later. Again, same dress, same route, same request. He stared at her as he pulled into the hospital lot and watched as she walked across a patch of lawn toward the building. This time he got out and called after her. No response. He walked toward the wall and found, instead of a side door, an old foundation where a wing had once been removed, a line where brick met cement and the light bent differently. He asked the night nurse if there was a side entrance. She told him the hospital had been rebuilt after a fire in the early 1980s, and that the wing he was pointing to had been demolished. Evidence Layer 1. The County Building Permit Archive contains a file on Mercy Ridge Hospital, application forms, demolition notices, and a typed memorandum dated 1985 referencing a wing removed post-fire, structural changes to east facade in 1984. No mention of an active side door after that date. A town newsletter from 1986 contains an obituary for a young woman named Lily Mercer, who died in a vehicular accident on the county highway. The obituary notes she had been trying to reach Mercy Ridge to see her mother, who was in hospice at the time. Evidence Layer 2. A memorial cross sits at the site where that highway curves before Mercy Ridge Junction. Passing truckers know it as the Lily Cross. A photograph taken by a local resident in 2019, included with a news article, shows a weathered wooden cross and flowers tucked around it, and the caption reads, Lily Mercer, 1984. Several drivers, interviewed by the local paper in subsequent months, reported seeing a woman asking for rides toward Mercy Ridge in the late night hours. Most described her similarly, the same floral dress, the same blank, pleading expression. The trucker drove her to Mercy Ridge at least 4 times over the span of 2 years. Each time her request was identical, each time she vanished at the hospital perimeter. On one occasion, the trucker insisted on following her. He drove slowly behind, watched her cross the lawn toward an invisible seam in the building, and then, he told investigators, she walked through the wall as if it were smoke. He stopped the truck, threw open the doors, ran up the steps, and found only a blank stretch of brick.
The security footage from that night, reviewed weeks later by the county, shows a truck pulling to the curb and a woman stepping out, the truck idling, and then no image of the woman crossing the lawn. The footage has an unexplained gap of 8 seconds at precisely the frame where witnesses say she crossed the lawn. Witness, trucker, edited. I saw her walk into the building and then there was nothing. No door. It's like she walked into a place that isn't there. When the trucker attempted to trace the hospital's own records, he found institutional memory that skirted the edges of truth. Nurses alive when Lily Mercer died remembered a patient by that name, but the name of the wing she intended to reach was changed in every retelling. In one conversation, a retired nurse told him, "Some people say she got to the wrong hospital. Some say she never made it off the shoulder." In another interview, an administrator spoke of renovations and lost blueprints.
The building, they said, had been remodeled so often that parts of its past were in storage boxes and not in active plans. Local rumors filled the gaps. A crash in 1984, a woman attempting to reach a dying mother, and a hospital that burned some of its records in 1985. Whether Lily Mercer was the woman who kept asking for Mercy Ridge, or whether several drivers were misremembering a single ghostly image, cannot be determined from the public files. What can be documented is the trucker's pattern of pickup. He reported the encounters to a regional safety inspector who filed a short memo included in the county archive that reads simply, "Multiple reports from long-haul drivers of recurring hitchhiker requesting Mercy Ridge. No criminal pattern established. Reports archived." What is telling about this case is how sightings propagate. After the trucker reported his experiences, 3 other drivers came forward saying they had driven the same woman to the same place. A rest stop attendant, interviewed anonymously in an article, said she had once turned a flashlight on the woman as she stood on the shoulder, and was struck by the way her dress seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She wasn't right behind the seam of the road, the attendant said. She was always 20 steps from the hospital, like she couldn't get further. The town erected the memorial cross on the curve and called it a way to remember the dead. The trucker stopped taking that route after the 4th time. He requested shifts that took him miles away. If there is a pattern here, it is a loop. The road, the cross, and a woman who is always trying to reach an address that may no longer allow visitors. What his headphones revealed was a chorus of small voices harmonizing a lullaby, and then, interleaved with the static, a whispering phrase that he could not place. Evidence Layer 1. Aaron's recorded log, entered into station files, lists a strange overlay at 0230 hours, with file names and an entry reading "Unfamiliar vocal tracks, playback altered by engineer." The logbook dates the discovery to January 17th. Aaron later filed an internal memo that read, "Playback contains reversed segments. Content includes children's song and repeated word stay. Uncertain source. Recommend investigation." Evidence Layer 2. While checking the transmitter room, Aaron found a small door behind an old shelving unit that led to a cavity within the station's foundation. Inside, in a space built like a tiny room, but sealed off, he found a small metal box bolted to the wall, and most disturbingly, a logbook bound in cracked leather. The logbook's last entry, written in a hand that had been penned decades ago, according to a handwriting analyst who later examined a photocopy, reads simply, "Final broadcast, 2:30. The date beside it was smudged, but legible enough to suggest early 1950s. The recorder Aaron saved contained a 10-second clip he later described in an interview with a regional reporter. He said that when he played the clip backwards, the lullaby became clear, and the whispered line resolved into pleading, "Don't sleep here," followed by laughter. He handed the recording to a friend in audio forensics. The friend, who asked to remain anonymous, transcribed the audible trace as children's voices followed by an unaccompanied whisper, "Stay with us." Reverse playback renders phrase unclear. Forward playback contains indecipherable low register. Station ownership history reveals a series of odd events. Old board minutes stored in the county archive show that in 1952, the station had a midwinter broadcast anomaly where volunteer announcers reported voices on frequency not our own. The minutes contain terse entries, discuss interference, commission to investigate possible unauthorized transmitter in basement. The commission apparently removed the equipment and sealed a section of wall, but the minutes end with findings inconclusive, no further action. After Aaron's discovery of the hidden cavity in the logbook, a small team comprising the station manager, a local historian, and a retired engineer tore open the sealed wall. The cavity contained beneath layers of bricked-up plaster a child's nickel toy, a length of frayed cloth, and a pair of tiny shoes.
The shoes were described in the municipal inventory as small, leather-bound, circa 1940s. The municipal inventory was later attached to an incident report. The historian who examined the items told a reporter that the specifics matched details of a long-missing staff member's child, a case the county had never publicly reconciled.
What scares people in these situations is not only the voice, but the connection between objects and sound. The presence of physical artifacts suggested a human story. The logbook's final broadcast entry indicated someone had been transmitting, maybe in secret, at 2:30 in that space decades earlier. Further investigation turned up an unsettling corollary. A county coroner's supplement from 1951 mentions unresolved in-station death of a staff member's child, the item buried in a box of unsorted coroner documents. The coroner's note is terse. No autopsy performed. Family accepts circumstances as accidental. Statement available in probate records. The probate records, while publicly available, had been misfiled in a box labeled miscellaneous. The documents are not explicit, but they describe a child missing for a late-night period and a resultant search that failed to find the child. Aaron's recording went public after he played a portion for a local news crew. The clip circulated on a web forum where users debated whether it had been manipulated. Some audio sleuths declared the frequency overlay a result of harmonic interference from a distant repeater. Others pointed to the logbook and the children's shoes. They argued that those were the sort of artifacts that demand explanations beyond physics. Aaron kept the recordings and the logbook. He handed digital copies to the county archives, which logged them as Donated Materials KMT Foundation. In his own words, he could not sleep in the station again. The station manager posted a notice that the basement would be closed to volunteers until inspection. The municipality ordered a short, quiet review and found no legal reason to demolish the station. The on-air signal returned, but several long-term volunteers left. Aaron's last documented entry in the logbook, before he took a leave of absence, reads, 2:30 a.m., static, then whisper, "I think I heard them call my name." He declined to elaborate when the regional reporter called. In the text of that interview, Aaron is described as visibly unsettled, requests privacy. The station remains operational, patched and painted, its basement permanently locked. At the point Aaron found the logbook and toys, the story hung like a strand across decades: a missing child, a final broadcast, and a man alone in the night who listened. The file is thick with documented facts and thin on resolution. Who sealed the wall? Why was the logbook left exposed? Did the air itself remember a transmission? Between stories, air and archives sometimes keep the same memory. Static is not mute. It holds the residue of everything that has ever tried to speak. The narration pauses here, mid-investigation, so that the next hour can take the listener deeper into towns where the earth itself seems to have a schedule.
Story 5. Harvest Night Secrets. Henderson Ridge. Microhook. He opened the envelope and saw a photograph of men filling a hole, and the man who showed it to her was dead 2 weeks later. The Harvest Festival in Henderson Ridge was supposed to be a small-town ritual. Tractors lined up in the park, a pie contest that always crowned the same 70-year-old judge, and a parade of pickup trucks with ribbons on their antennas. It was the kind of annual return that stitches people back to a place. The visitor, identified in the files as the hometown guest, had come back after years away, a city life behind her and the comfortable ache of memory pressing her to walk old streets. She reconnected with Henry, an old friend who still lived in town and worked nights at the grain elevator. Henry was the kind of person who collected small, dark things in the corners of his life: photographs pressed into books, a drawer full of utility receipts folded into neat stacks. On a humid October night, after booths had been packed away and the park emptied into the dimming sidewalks, Henry handed her a packet of Polaroids. They were strange, half-blurred images of men at the edge of a field, hands foxed with dirt, shovels in the soil. In one picture, a shape could be seen falling between two shoulders, a bloom of dark that might have been a body being lowered. Witness, hometown guest, edited. Henry slid the pictures across and just said, "You need to see this." He looked broken, like someone who had held something too heavy for too long. The guest asked where the photos had come from. Henry's answer was a warning. He said he'd found them in a lockbox in the back of the feed store behind layers of old receipts. He told his friend then, whispered, that they were men in town who did things and then smiled over coffee as if nothing had happened. That night, Henry stayed late to talk. The guest left before midnight with the pictures tucked under her coat. 2 weeks later, a hunting party found Henry's truck at the edge of a back road, and near the tailgate, signs indicated he'd been struck and died. The county coroner listed cause as blunt trauma consistent with a high-impact fall.
The report categorized it as accidental pending investigation. Evidence Layer 1. The packet of photographs, later received by a regional reporter, was dated in ink on the back with a single notation, Harvest Night 86, though the images themselves looked older. The reporter published one image in a cautious article that recounted Henry's death and the existence of the photographs. The caption noted the image shows 3 men covering something in a shallow pit. The photograph had been taken at night and contained a set of tire tracks leading toward an outbuilding that still stood on the edge of town. Evidence Layer 2. The guest turned the pictures over to the county prosecutor's office and filed an anonymous tip. The office opened a file marked Henderson Ridge, potential homicide.
Investigators interviewed 3 local men who appeared in the photos. 2 denied involvement and provided alibis. The third could not be located for questioning. The file contains an investigator's handwritten note. Photographs potentially incriminating. Subject A reluctant, Subject B adamant, local witnesses uncooperative. For a small town, the latter phrase is a polite shorthand for a community that will not point a finger at its own. A week after Henry's death, his friend, the hometown guest, received an anonymous letter at her rented apartment. Inside, a single Polaroid, the same image of the men shoveling. On the back, scrawled in a handshake of print and ink, "We bury what belongs to us." She turned the photograph into police. An evidence log confirms receipt and a notation that the writer's identity is unknown. The case file contains a summary stating, "No forensic match established, photographs authentic, investigation ongoing." In practice, ongoing in this kind of file often becomes bureaucratic inertia. The prosecutor's office, strapped for resources, moved the case down the docket. Months lengthened into a year. Witness, hometown guest, edited. After Henry, I didn't trust the town. The people who'd always been your neighbors, they looked at you like you were a grocery list they didn't want to read. The guest pursued the documents further. She tracked a ledger entry, one of Henry's invoices, that linked a local property owner, listed only as landowner A in the file, with a series of payments around the time the photographs were taken. The ledger itself was a mundane item, invoices for equipment rental, and a single line item that read, "Cleanup, $150. The prosecutor's office declined to pursue charges, citing insufficient evidence to prove criminal intent. The Harvest Night photos remain a split image in Henderson Ridge's memory. On one hand, a scandal for a handful of whispered conversations. On the other, a closed book because the men in the photos still sat at church dinners and school board meetings. Henry's death was entered in public records as an accidental fall. The pictures were archived as exhibits, closed case. Those who saw the images spoke of them with a muted anger that suggested fear, not bravado. The guest left town within a year and published an account under a pseudonym on a regional message board. The post drew replies from several users claiming to have seen similar photos in other towns decades ago, images of men filling pits after harvests, men who looked too ordinary to be monsters. For the guest, the most haunting thing was not the image of the pit itself, but the town's unwillingness to look at it and at those who did. The file ends with a typed memo from the prosecutor, "No further action recommended." The moral ledger of that line remains unsettled for those who remember Henry. Bridge. Harvests bring in grain and reveal hidden things.
In many Montana towns, communal rituals are the same nights the underbelly becomes visible, if you know where to look. Story 6. The Millbrook Circuit. Microhook. For 72 hours, nothing in town would power on, and a resident simply vanished. Millbrook, a town built around a once proud mill and a church spire that punctured the valley sky, called in an electrical engineer when the oddities escalated. At first, the problem looked like an equipment failure. Sudden motor stallings, car ignitions that would not catch, household breakers that tripped and would not reset. Then the phenomena coalesced into something more severe. For roughly 3 days, electronics and combustion engines inside an irregular boundary, what locals would later call the Millbrook Circle, simply failed. Radios stayed dead. Watches stopped. Vehicles would not restart even with repeated cranks. Outside the boundary, nothing seemed affected. The engineer, referred to in records as the electrical engineer, arrived with a truck full of testing gear and a pragmatic calm. He sat on a stoop and watched a soda vending machine in the diner try to start and then sigh without power. He walked the town with a geomagnetic reader and a field notebook, barking short observations into his recorder. Evidence Layer 1, a municipal incident report, documents the failure window with precise timestamps. First reported at 03:18 on a Tuesday. Emergency calls for non-functioning medical devices logged at 03:51. Service repairs attempted by the county utility company at 07:05, but aborted. The utilities technician's note reads, "Localized failure, grid intact, service lines show normal load, inability to detect outage source." The technician added a later memo that existentially unsettled the file. Affected zone roughly circular. Previous notes on file from 1977 and 2007 mention similar event.
Evidence Layer 2. Town archives contain a series of clippings every 30 years apart, 1952, 1982, 2012, each describing a temporary failure and, notably, a missing person. The engineer found that pattern himself when he pulled microfiche at the county library. Each article used different phrasing: electrical anomaly, localized blackout, unexplained device failure, but all placed the event in the third week of June, and all attached a brief notice about an individual who had disappeared during the event. The engineer's tests in Millbrook were methodical. He set up receivers and took soil conductivity readings outside the town square. He noted a rhythmic electromagnetic fluctuation that seemed to beat like a distant heart, regular dips of energy at roughly 15-second intervals under his field readings. On the second night, he felt the town differently. Standing at the old spring chamber beneath the square, he described a low thumping under the soles of his boots as if some machine pulsed in the earth. Witness, engineer, edited. It wasn't like any interference I've measured. The instruments pulsed.
I could feel it underfoot. At one point, the meter pegged, and then everything went dead. Lights, phones, the whole town. For 72 hours, nothing would take a charge. During the powerless days, residents improvised. Candles lit porches and gas stoves, and a neighborhood watch formed around the older residents who relied on medication. At the end of the third day, everything came back. Appliances rebooted as if plugged into a compliant world. Cars coughed to life, and watches resumed their tick. But one woman, an 80-year-old who kept the town ledger and who had been seen stepping out of her house the night the failure began, was gone. Her bed was made, her teacup cold on the table. The house's only sign of disturbance was the back door unlocked and a thin circle of muddy prints leading toward the spring, then stopping at the edge of the square. The engineer took soil samples from that spring and cataloged them in his report. He noted the composition was unremarkable: silt, loam. Yet cuttings from the paving around the spring chamber showed a thin ring of vitrified surface, as if heat had glazed the stone long ago. The sample photographs are part of the engineer's report, attached to a municipal file that is marked Millbrook Anomaly. Town elders interviewed in local papers told stories that bridged the scientific and the mythic. One retired mill worker described an oral memory his grandmother told him. Every 30 years, the town breathes out. People say the earth takes its due, and then it forgets again. Another elder pointed to an old stone marker in the cemetery with a date and a single initial. The marker's inscription had been worn to the point of illegibility, but a rubbing showed the same year aligned with the timing of the 3 prior blackouts. The missing woman's family filed a missing persons report. Search teams combed the wooded rim above town, the river coulee, and the abandoned mill pits. Tracking dogs did not find a trail leaving town in any standard way. The official file contains a line that reads, "No physical evidence of transport. No forensic indication of third-party involvement. The case remains open in the county's records." Witness, family member, edited. She kept the account book. She walked out like she was going to get something and never came back. I keep thinking, what did she hear? Did something call her? The engineer's final recommendation in his 20-page analysis was to install monitoring equipment and to create a community watch for the predicted return of the phenomenon, because the pattern in the archives suggested a recurring window. His report is attached to municipal minutes with a small blue sticky note. Install monitors, pending budget. The monitors were never installed. Bridge, interlude after 6. There are places on the map where patterns repeat like clockwork. Whether the repetition is natural, social, or something else is where worry begins to grow.
In Millbrook, the pulse under the town was as literal as it was metaphorical, a rhythm the living could not agree to ignore. Story 7. The Cabin Children. Patterson Hollow again. Microhook. Drawings dated 1847 were tucked beneath a floorboard, and at night something answered back. The ranger in this account, registered simply in the files as the park ranger, was assigned to a remote backcountry cabin on the edge of a national preserve outside of Patterson Hollow. It was a seasonal duty, a rotation into solitude that served as a reset, wood stove, trail checks, and a logbook with neat entries. The ranger's report begins with routine notes, then widens into something more peculiar. While cleaning the cabin one afternoon, the ranger pulled up a loose floorboard and found a bundle of small, brittle sketches wrapped in oilcloth. The drawings, done in a child's hand, showed wagons and small stick figures with eyes rendered as dots. Along the corner of one page, a date was written in a slanted script, June 1847. The pages smelled like old paper and wood smoke.
In the margin of the ranger's log, he wrote, "Found children's drawings under floor. Local Historical Society contacted." Evidence Layer 1. The park's artifact log lists the find with accession number and a photograph, grainy but legible images of the drawings. The images were forwarded to a university historian who confirmed in an emailed note later included in the park file that the paper and ink composition were consistent with mid-19th century materials. The historian also attached a short paragraph about a historically documented wagon train that passed near the preserve in 1847 and reported in a county ledger as having lost several children to exposure and river accidents. Evidence Layer 2. A trail camera installed to monitor wildlife around the cabin caught images across 3 nights that defied easy categorization. At 23:47 on July 12th, the camera recorded an exposure in which small figures, pale, thin, and dressed in garments that looked old-fashioned, stood at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the cabin. Their faces were indistinct, and their eyes, caught in the flash, appeared to shimmer. Another frame showed what looked like the same children sitting on the cabin steps, their knees drawn up. The ranger, reviewing the footage, said the audio attached to the motion sensor registered a series of small, high-pitched sounds, laughter or perhaps wind, but the pitch carried the cadence of childish voices. Witness, Ranger, edited. "I heard them at night. At first I thought raccoons or foxes. Then you start to hear the patter, little feet. And once, when I opened the door, they were there. Pale, quiet. They asked for help." The ranger described an encounter on the 3rd night. He wrote in his log that he opened the cabin door to find 2 small children at the threshold, their clothing unfamiliar, faded, with button fronts and ankle lengths.
The ranger told a regional reporter he remembered their speech as slow and archaic. They asked for water and mother. Their hands, he said, were cold and almost translucent. Afraid and unnerved, he closed the door and recorded the encounter in the log. There is an archive of a memorial listing a wagon train mishap from 1847 that mentions 3 children unaccounted for in a passing notation. The historian's note, again attached to the ranger file, reads, "Documented losses in wagon train near current preserve. Names not recorded. Oral history references children left in the trees." A county marker near the wagon trail recites a dry memorial inscription. Local guides sometimes skip it in tours, as if the memory is better kept mute. The ranger pursued research. He reached out to a group of volunteer archivists who dug into probate records and homestead logs and recovered a letter from 1851 that refers obliquely to "children of the train" and a petty court note about "goods salvaged but not recovered." The ranger also noted that the drawings themselves sometimes reappeared in different places, one night missing from the artifact bag, then found again tucked under the cabin stool, untouched, and with a new faint smudge in the corner like fresh charcoal. Witness, Ranger, edited. "It felt like they wanted you to remember. They wanted an answer. Once I took a photograph and later found the film fogged, like it had been exposed to something else." After the encounter, the ranger resigned his post early. In his resignation email, which is in the park's personnel file, he wrote that the nights drew long and the children kept asking. He left the camera footage and the drawings with the preserve's curator, who logged them into an evidence box. Curators later told reporters they felt an ethical obligation to publicly attribute the objects as found artifacts of unknown provenance, careful not to declare any direct link between the materials and the missing children of 1847. The cabin still sees rotations. New rangers are told to check the floorboards and keep an inventory of found items. For those who have worked there, the cabin sits like a hinge between 2 eras, a place where a single scrap of paper can carry the weight of a grief that refuses to stay buried in time. Bridge. Some things are small and persistent, the way a child's drawing refuses to be simply a child's drawing. In places where history is close to the surface, objects can act as signals. Whether they point to a wound or a memory depends on who has the courage to interpret them. Story 8. The Diner Conversation, Haydenbrook Outskirts. Microhook. He overheard 2 men plan a burial. Then they noticed him noticing. The salesman in this narrative, called the traveling salesman in files, made a living on the road, coffee at kiosks, knees stiff from long drives, a satchel of small wares, and practiced small talk.
One winter afternoon, he stopped at a diner just outside a town identified in the records as Havenbrook. The diner was a warm bubble of light, pie under glass domes, and a counter that had witnessed a generation of conversations. He sat alone, ate quickly, and nodded at the regulars. At the far corner, 2 men he didn't know joked in low voices about a high-out and a hole out back. The salesman listened, because if you are paid to notice customer details, it's easier to catch a trick of speech.
The men spoke in casual tones about taking care of something up at an old property outside town. It was the sort of throwaway violence people sometimes use in a bar to flirt with shock. The salesman finished his coffee, left, and thought nothing of it. Then he saw the truck. He noticed a white pickup that had pulled out directly behind his as he left, the taillights dimming then flaring to match his lane changes. After a stretch of highway and repeated rearward glances, he realized he was being followed. He turned off onto a county road, and the truck mimicked him. The salesman pulled into a gas station and stayed inside for an hour, watching through the glass as the truck idled across the pumps. When he returned to his car, there were new scratches on the driver's door and a photograph taped to the windshield, an image of a shallow, freshly dug pit with a layer of disturbed earth. Evidence Layer 1. The salesman reported the following day to a sheriff's deputy and brought the photograph. The deputy logged the report as possible intimidation. The photograph was cataloged and later included in a county file. The evidence note reads, "Photo depicts disturbed earth at property X. Investigator unable to verify date taken. Seller reports being followed and threatened. No immediate arrests." The investigator's supplement explains that the property pictured in the photograph, an overgrown parcel owned by an absentee landowner, had been the subject of 2 unrelated missing person inquiries a decade prior. Evidence Layer 2. Days later, the sheriff's department executed a search of the property and found the pit. Excavation revealed human remains consistent with 2 adults. The coroner's initial report lists the cause of death as traumatic injury, time of death estimated between 2 and 8 weeks prior. The file includes a chain of custody photograph of the excavation and a statement from the coroner noting that decomposition had reached a stage that limited the ability to determine some details. The photograph matches the image taped to the salesman's windshield. After the discovery, the salesman began to receive escalating threats, envelopes with photos, anonymous phone calls in the night. The threats were specific and chilling, a catalog of personal details that suggested the senders had watched him after his diner conversation.
The sheriff's department expanded the investigation. Detectives interviewed the 2 men who had been in the diner, both with records of petty crimes and ties to local crews who worked odd jobs. Both men denied direct involvement and offered to take polygraph tests. Neither completed one. The investigation identified one of the men's pickup trucks as being in the vicinity of the property around the time of the body's estimated death. That truck's odometer and gas receipts were subpoenaed. Records placed the vehicle in a town 20 miles away for much of the date range, according to receipts from a chain store. Witness. They watched me leave. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then that picture at my car, I knew it wasn't. I called the sheriff, and then things got worse. The local paper reported the deaths with the cautious tone small-town papers use when the accused might still be neighbors. Authorities investigate discovery of remains. No arrests made. The article quoted the sheriff saying, "Investigation ongoing," and it printed the usual plea for witnesses. In the weeks that followed, there were late-night calls, the kind that are designed to shake someone into silence. The salesman, unnerved and fearing for his safety, moved along a route where he thought the truck would not follow. The case remains unsolved in terms of motive and full connectivity. The men who spoke in the diner were never charged. The missing people's families received a measure of closure when remains were interred, but the community felt the tremor of knowing ordinary men were capable of lethal concealment. The sanitation of daytime life, grocery lines, children at soccer practice, continued, but underneath ran the thread of who knew and why they stayed silent. Bridge. Sometimes truth arrives in a plastic sleeve or an envelope stuck to a windshield. Small towns protect their own in 100 quiet ways. That same protection can become its own kind of violence when used to hide what people have done. Story 9. The Missing Hours of Havenbrook, Montana. Microhook. She stopped for gas, and suddenly the sun was 3 hours lower, and everyone in town acted as if she had never been there. The woman in this last account is identified in the county file only as the Traveler. Her story is the kind that stubbornly resists neat explanations. She was driving west on a 2-lane and stopped at a tiny service station on the edge of a town she later referred to as Havenbrook. She bought coffee, paid cash, and kept the receipt. According to the timestamp on the receipt, the purchase occurred at 14:07. When she swore and consulted the clock on her dash, it read 17:12. She had no memory of the intervening 3 hours. Evidence Layer 1. She retained the receipt, which she later handed to a clerk at a gas station in a neighboring county when she realized something had gone very wrong.
The receipt's timestamps were confirmed by the clerk and logged as part of the report. The traveler submitted to a medical exam. The physician's note in the emergency department file records normal vital signs and no signs of physical assault. And the clinician's note attributes her claim of missing time to possible dissociative episode while advising follow-up with a specialist. Evidence Layer 2. A series of forum posts and archived chat room threads later linked to the town of Havenbrook kept a running tally of lost hours reports over a decade. Contributors to the thread posted anecdotal corroborations. A trucker who remembered stopping for a cigarette and then finding his watch 3 hours behind. A hunter who woke with his gear packed and his truck pointing in the other direction with no memory of having moved it. The traveler's receipt became on that form a kind of talisman, proof that physical timepieces and paper could not always be trusted.
The traveler reported that when she tried to ask about what had happened in the gas station, the attendant had been curt, directing her to leave. She described the people in the town as offering closed smiles and evasive answers. "We don't like to talk about that road," one elderly woman told her. When she later attempted to find the service station again, following the same map coordinates and landmarks, she drove for miles and could not find it. She returned the next week, and the country roads shifted. Some of the markers she had used, the broken fence post, the white farmhouse with paint flaking, were either gone or in different positions. The traveler showed photographs she took on her phone to a county investigator. The photos existed on her device with metadata, but when matched against satellite imagery, small discrepancies appeared. Hedgerows were in different places, and the angle of a barn's shadow did not match the timestamp. Witness, traveler, edited. "I kept checking the receipt like it was a Bible. I had 3 hours missing and a town that acted like none of it had happened. The clerk told me to get out of there. People stared when I asked questions." The county did a cursory search into land records and public works files and could not find any evidence that a gas station had been physically removed in the weeks following her visit. The traveler took a scrap of sidewalk and a grocery receipt to the county clerk, who archived the material as part of her report. A later independent researcher compiled a list, pulled from newspaper microfiche, of similar accounts tied to the same stretch of highway, delayed clocks, recollection lapses, and places that appeared and then vanished. They called the phenomenon pocket hours in an online preprint, a term intended to describe the apparent temporal disjunction. Skeptics argued that stress, an unnoticed fainting spell, or intoxication could explain the missing hours. Clinicians offered psychiatric explanations as plausible.
Yet the physical receipt, the forum accounts, and the small inconsistencies in maps meant some pieces resisted those reductive explanations. The traveler, traumatized and shaken, avoided highways that went near Havenbrook for the rest of her life. She told the investigator that she felt as if someone had picked up a page from her day and removed it. The county file concludes with a cautious line: "No criminality determined. Events may be psychological, environmental, or otherwise unexplained." On internet message boards, the story spread, and attendees at late-night forums shared their own versions, some earnest, some clearly fictionalized, of a road that swallowed time. The traveler, when contacted years later by a documentary researcher, refused to be interviewed on camera. She provided a written statement that reads, "I keep the receipt in my wallet. I look at it when I can't sleep. It is proof that time can fail you." Endings and aftermaths, tying threads together. Each of these accounts is different in detail and similar in mood, a thin place where ordinary lives intersect with something that resists tidy explanation. Together they form a map of unease across Montana's small towns, fog that presses at windows, a blood trail that stops in clear air, a woman walking toward a facade that no longer exists, voices that bleed through static, photographs that implicate, an earth that pulses, children whose drawings keep surfacing, men who speak in diners, and hours that vanish like spilled milk. The documentary traces of these events are varied. Some are a single witness statement, some are files, police reports, coroner supplements, archived minutes, with the precise bureaucratic language of investigation. In every case, the records and the living accounts complicate each other. Witnesses remember certain details that the files do not, and records contain dry entries that suggest more than any single testimony could hold. What is consistent across Henderson Ridge and Millbrook, Patterson Hollow and Havenbrook, is a way communities respond. There is secrecy, due in part to closeness and in part to self-preservation. There is the awkward tension between protecting reputations and pursuing truth. There are people who leave and people who remain, their memories accumulating like dust in attics. And there is the persistent image that refuses to be forgotten, the faceless pressure on glass, a child's drawing, a memorial cross at the highway, a hollow where the blood trail stops. Final coda, a lingering image. I will leave you with one image that threads through these accounts, the thing that came to me again and again as I sifted through files and spoke to witnesses. Imagine a quiet, ordinary night in a small Montana town. The fog rolls into the hollow like a slow tide, swallowing porch lights and trimming the edges of the world to soft gray. On a back stoop, a dog whimpers.
Someone peels back a curtain and, for a breath, sees a pale surface pressed to the glass. No eyes, no mouth, only the impression of a face where a face should be, and the sense that whatever it is listening to the life that used to live there. These are reported accounts. We have relied on witness interviews, police logs, archival material, and periodicals. Names were changed where necessary. Details were anonymized to respect privacy. In some files you'll find dates and receipts and photographs. In others, you'll find margins scrawled with question marks and grief. Some cases remain open. Some seem to close in the peculiar way small towns close things, quietly, without headlines. If one thread remains clear, it's this: ordinary places can become uncanny, not because they are haunted in some sensational sense, but because ordinary routines can collide with patterns and histories that refuse to remain private. The result leaves people unsettled, communities guarded, and questions unanswered. If a single story from tonight's episode stayed with you, tell us which one in the comments, if you dare. And if you want to keep hearing these deep dives into quiet places and strange nights, subscribe and bookmark All Night Horrors. He watched something press its faceless head to the back door, and then for a long moment, it simply stood there, silent, still, as if listening for a life that had once belonged to the house. The last thing the valley ever hears is often the thing we never quite explain. Good night.